The alien sights and sounds of the city perplexed and aggravated the Mongols. For once, discipline broke down. The soldiers ran amok. They rode up and down the narrow streets, setting everything ablaze. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in a frenzy of uncontrolled butchery. A visiting ambassador reported that when the fires were put out, the city was littered with corpses and the streets greasy with human fat. Genghis Khan was not there to see the slaughter. He was already preoccupied by events far off to the west. In 1218, a caravan of Mongol merchants traveling to the great Western Empire of the Kharazm Shah were stopped and then executed as spies. Genghis sent an envoy to demand an explanation. When the envoy was also executed, Genghis Khan was furious. Revenge was inevitable. The Kharazm Shah's empire was fabulously wealthy, especially the cities, for they lay along the Great Silk Road, from China to the Middle East. The greatest of these cities was the capital, Samarkand, which the Kharazm Shah had turned into an opulent pleasure palace. Here lived Chinese and Persian artisans who wove silk, worked leather, produced silver lame, wove carpets, and even forged an early type of steel. It was a lively, cosmopolitan society. The Kharazm Shah himself was a vain creature, fated by his courtiers as the second Alexander the Great. He believed their flattery and was confident he could handle this arrogant barbarian called Genghis Khan. Genghis took his time. Indeed, he took a year to prepare for the campaign. He withdrew his army from China, summoned men from every corner of the steppe, and put together the greatest concentration of Mongol power ever seen. Estimates put the Mongol army at more than 100,000, but it was probably still less than half the size of the Kharazm Shah's forces. Before setting out, Genghis sent word to the king of Xixia, calling in his promise to provide troops whenever they were needed. But the king replied that if Genghis didn't have enough men, then he didn't deserve to be the great Khan. As Genghis turned his army west, he resolved one day to avenge this insult. The Mongols faced a march of more than 1,500 miles towards their objective, the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand. Their spies had told them that the Kharazm Shah had deployed his defenses along the Sir Darya River, the empire's frontier. Genghis divided his army into 4 separate divisions, 3 of which attacked the frontier at several points at once. The 4th and largest contingent, led by Genghis himself, secretly crossed the Sir Darya River further north, and then promptly disappeared. Instead of turning south towards the enemy lines, Genghis led his army due west, straight into the Kizil Kum desert. The Kizil Kum was impenetrable. There were no known waterholes, no roads, no landmarks. But Genghis had a guide who did know a route of a sort through the wasteland. For months, his contingent made its way secretly across the sands. Then, in March 1218, as the defending armies used up their strength against the other Mongol attacks, Genghis suddenly emerged, over 400 miles behind their lines, outside the walls of Bukhara. Military historians still point to it as one of the most dramatic outflanking movements in the history of warfare. Panic swept through the city, and shortly afterwards the Bukhara garrison abandoned their posts. Once inside, Genghis and his men galloped into what they imagined was a palace. When it was explained that he was inside a mosque, he ordered that it be converted into stables. Copies of the Quran were thrown to the four winds, and the boxes that had held them were used as mangers. Then Genghis mounted the pulpit and berated the citizens about the treachery of their sultan and the reasons for his victory.
I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, he would not have sent a punishment like me.
Terrified by the accounts of massacres in China, the Bukharans awaited their fate. Unlike China, the sacking of Bukhara was disciplined and controlled. Beneath this very minaret, thousands of people were put to death as a deliberate warning to others that there was no alternative to immediate submission. The city was stripped of its treasures and a tribute extracted from the wealthy families. Then most of the women and children were herded off to Mongolia. The city walls were then systematically destroyed, and refugees were dispatched to spread the news that Bukhara had fallen. Genghis Khan was a knowing exponent of psychological warfare. A large contingent of the male population was then herded out in front of his army, and with this human shield, Genghis marched on Samarkand. From behind these very walls, the citizens of Samarkand watched for the dust cloud of the approaching Mongols. The Kharazm Shah had already abandoned them. He had fled westward a few days earlier. The Mongols put to the torch that part of the city which lay outside the walls, and Samarkand surrendered within 5 days. Within just a few months, the Mongols had smashed one of the largest empires in the world. But there was still a personal score to settle. To seek out the Kharazm Shah, one of Genghis Khan's finest generals, Subadai, was dispatched to the west. Genghis himself turned south toward Afghanistan in pursuit of the Sultan's son and the remnants of the empire's army. To the Mongols, this was a strange and alien land. They knew of it only from stories told by nomadic wanderers like these, who had journeyed between China and Afghanistan for centuries. A 1,000 years before Christ, Zarathustra had preached to his followers here. 700 years later, Alexander marched his army through these hills. Now came Genghis Khan. The cities of these parts were some of the oldest known to man, and among the wealthiest. Places like Merv, Naishapur, Tus, Herat, Balkh. Genghis Khan and his army had only once before seen cities like these, and that was thousands of miles away in China. From Samarkand all the way to the Indus River, almost everything they came across was a revelation. To a people who traveled only with what they could carry on their horses and who lived in felt tents, it was bewildering. Genghis Khan determined that in future his people would live their lives as richly endowed as these people. Glassware, silks, pottery, carpets, tapestries, gold, silverware. These were the trappings of cities that had for centuries set their inhabitants apart from the nomads. These things would now adorn the inside of Mongol tents. They were loaded up and taken back across the steppes in massive caravans. More importantly, the Mongols also sent back to their homeland all of the artisan families who produced these works. Alongside them marched clerics, physicians, mystics, and poets. From the great city of Gurganch, chroniclers claimed, 100,000 artisans were deported. The story was repeated everywhere. It was one of the greatest enforced migrations in history. The tools, raw materials, and all the skills of the great cities were transplanted to the empty grasslands of Central Asia. This was more than just plunder. Genghis was setting down the foundations of an empire. The most highly prized of the city dwellers were the metal workers and engineers. These were the people who would build and update the Mongol war machinery. They would forge scimitars, design and manufacture catapults and ballistas and all the other siege machines the Mongols would deploy in future campaigns. Suddenly, a people who had known little more than herding and hunting now had in their employ some of the finest tool makers, metal workers and artisans in the world.